Hidden behind centuries-old palace walls lies a vault few have ever seen and fewer still have touched. After Queen Elizabeth's passing, King Charles believed the contents of her private jewellery archive had remained untouched, until whispers began to reach his ears. What he discovered behind that sealed door would fracture trust, spark fury, and raise dangerous questions about Camilla's intentions. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For generations, the Queen's private jewellery collection had remained sacred, an archive of heirlooms, personal tokens, and irreplaceable gems locked away from the public eye. Separate from the official crown jewels, these pieces held a different kind of power, emotional, symbolic, and deeply personal. The late monarch had kept this vault guarded with near-obsessive privacy, allowing access to only 2 people throughout her reign: her most trusted secretary, and eventually her son Charles. The vault was never intended to be a public spectacle, nor an open inheritance for anyone in the family. It was a chamber of legacy, sealed behind layers of royal protocol and intention, awaiting the hand of the next sovereign to decide its fate. But legacy, as it turned out, had a way of stirring unrest even after death. The first stirrings of doubt came quietly, almost dismissively, a hushed comment between palace staffers, a casual remark from a long-time butler, a faintly odd detail in an internal logistics report. Charles, still drowning in the grief of his mother's passing and the responsibilities of ascension, waved the concerns away at first. The idea that anything could have disturbed the Queen's personal sanctum seemed absurd. The vault, after all, was supposed to remain closed until a formal redistribution. There were no scheduled audits, no requests for viewing, and no public ceremonies that would require those particular treasures. It was meant to sleep beneath the palace, untouched and undisturbed. Then came the document. A minor clerical mishap, the kind of bureaucratic shuffle that often gets lost in transition, yet this one found its way to Charles's desk, with chilling implications. An inventory list, dated suspiciously close to the Queen's funeral, contained item codes that no longer matched the master ledger. A few handwritten notes in the margins raised more questions than they answered. The items were marked removed for assessment. But no official request had been logged, no approval granted, no return date recorded. It was as if someone had walked into the shadows of grief and taken what wasn't yet theirs. That night, Charles summoned his closest aide and requested the vault be opened. No announcements, no official paperwork, just silence, shadow, and a rising dread that something was wrong. As the heavy steel door groaned open, the room was flooded not with grief, but disbelief. Velvet-lined trays lay partially empty. Display cases were missing their central gems. Placards labelled with heirloom titles had no accompanying item. The absence was loud, echoing. This wasn't just misplacement. This was intrusion, violation, a breach of both protocol and something far deeper: trust. The king stood frozen, scanning what should have been a perfectly preserved legacy, his mother's legacy. But the vault had been touched, not officially, not ceremonially, and not with his consent. Somewhere in the overlap of mourning and monarchy, someone had slipped past tradition and stolen something far greater than gold. It wasn't the value of what was missing that left him cold, it was the silence. The fact that no one had spoken of it until now. The fact that someone, somewhere, had acted before the crown even had the chance to grieve. But the vault door was only the beginning. The real shock came with what wasn't inside. When King Charles stepped inside the Queen's private vault, he expected to feel grief, not betrayal. Yet, as he traced his fingers along the empty silk displays, it became clear certain pieces were gone. Not loaned, not stored, missing. And one name kept surfacing in quiet whispers: Camilla. The absence of items wasn't vague. It was deliberate, targeted. The vault didn't look ransacked, it looked selectively stripped. The Queen's most emotionally significant pieces, ones rarely seen, never lent, and intimately tied to the family's inner history, were simply not there. The Delhi Durbar emerald choker, last worn by Queen Elizabeth only during private family anniversaries, had vanished. The Greville tiara, a symbol of dignity passed down through turbulent decades, was no longer among the listed holdings. Queen Mary's bangles, their designs ancient and embedded with personal engravings, were missing altogether. These weren't accessories, these were bloodline artifacts. Each missing item told a deeper story, one of intentions, secrets, and unspoken promises now seemingly broken. King Charles, still reeling from the weight of coronation and mourning, turned to his mother's personal notes. Scribbled in aging ink and filed meticulously in her handwriting were records of each piece, who they belonged to, their emotional meaning, and in many cases who she believed should receive them when the time came. What Charles found was devastating. The missing items weren't just valuable, they were chosen. They had designated successors. The emerald choker was meant for Catherine. The Greville tiara, left unnamed but noted with the words future queen, not present, a line so cryptic yet suddenly painfully clear. And the bangles, marked Charlotte, for her to know her lineage. These notes weren't official declarations, but they were a mother's final wishes, and they had been ignored, perhaps even knowingly violated. An anonymous staff member, previously overlooked, came forward quietly, not to accuse, but to hint. In the days following the Queen's funeral, during the early hours of grief and ceremonial fog, they remembered seeing select cases being quietly carried from the vault under the supervision of 2 senior aides. The staffer hadn't thought much of it then, assuming perhaps the items were being prepared for future displays or preservation. But now, looking back with a clearer mind and a heavier heart, they weren't so sure. There had been no paperwork, no formal orders, just the quiet shuffle of legacy removed under the veil of grief. As the investigation deepened, another unsettling layer emerged. Surveillance footage routinely archived and monitored for decades had a strange, unexplained gap. 3 full days of missing footage from the corridor that led to the vault. No technical fault, no maintenance schedule, just a void. One that coincided perfectly with the reported removals, and still the pressure on Charles remained not to act. Senior advisors, locked in their devotion to protecting the monarchy's image, urged restraint. Family unity, they called it. No, nay. Ed to ignite scandal. Not now, not so soon. But unity had already been broken the moment the Queen Consort began wearing certain unfamiliar pieces at public events. At first they drew admiration, then suspicion. Royal historians and jewelry watchers, meticulous and relentless, began identifying unmistakable stones, designs, arrangements. Subtle changes couldn't mask the truth. Camilla was appearing in jewels that had no clear public origin, yet bore a haunting resemblance to the vault's missing heirlooms. Quiet speculation became online investigation. Social media sleuths compared archived images, linking the timelines with disturbing accuracy. And while Charles remained publicly silent, the storm was now building behind palace doors. But silence was no longer an option once Charles uncovered where the missing pieces had reappeared. Camilla had been seen in jewels no royal expert could identify until now. Hidden within custom designs and reworked settings were unmistakable royal stones. A private jeweler's account, long protected by NDA, revealed the unspeakable truth. Camilla had reimagined the Queen's treasures, without permission. The confirmation came not from the palace, nor from any official report, but from a leak, quiet, careful, and damning. A trusted insider from a luxury Mayfair jeweler reached out anonymously, his conscience outweighing the secrecy he had once been paid to uphold. The man spoke in cautious phrases, but the message was unmistakable. The stones used in recent commissions for the Queen Consort were not new acquisitions. They were historic, unmistakable, traceable. And worse, they were altered beyond recognition. The Delhi Durbar emeralds, once nestled in a regal choker of royal heritage, had been broken down and reset into an entirely modern pendant and ring ensemble. The Greville tiara, stripped of its signature structure, had been reduced to its most valuable stones, now reappearing in Camilla's newer, sleeker headpieces. Queen Mary's century-old bangles? Their unique diamond arrangement was found repurposed into a necklace with no historical markings. The jeweler, under strict orders to never speak, finally broke his silence in private, revealing that the commissions had been carried out under immense pressure and immense secrecy. The client, he said, had demanded speed, Discretion, no questions, no records beyond physical invoices, and even those had been coded under pseudonyms. Most striking of all was the timing. The alterations had begun only days after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, before the mourning period was formally over, before Charles had even conducted the first family council regarding inheritance or ceremonial redistribution. Camilla hadn't waited for tradition. She had acted, quietly, decisively, and with a chilling sense of entitlement. For King Charles, the discovery was more than a violation of protocol, it was personal. When presented with the before and after images, taken from archival photos and matched with recent public appearances, he reportedly fell silent for an extended time. What he saw wasn't just aesthetic change. It was historical erasure. His mother's wishes, her tastes, her memories, all stripped away and melted down into something new, something unrecognizable. The jewels had outlived monarchs. They had survived wars. And now they had been remodeled into fashion accessories without a word of consent. For a man already torn between duty and love, between crown and family, the emotional weight was unbearable. Privately, Charles began asking questions his advisors had hoped he would never raise. Who signed off on the transfers? Who allowed access to the vault? Why were no red flags raised when the gem settings began to change? And more dangerously, what else had been altered without his knowledge, and without the Queen's blessing? As pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one thought persisted. Camilla hadn't merely borrowed the jewels. She had taken ownership of them in every sense. The designs now reflected her, not the monarchy, her tastes, her legacy, her rewrite of history. But the deepest betrayal wasn't in metal or stone, it was buried in a letter the Queen never meant for Camilla to read. She had written it knowing the end was near, a single letter, sealed in her personal red box marked for my son only. But King Charles wasn't the first to read it, and by the time he opened it, the damage was already done. The red box had always been sacred, its presence a constant in the Queen's daily life, its contents known only to her and her closest aides. It wasn't just a container of state documents, it was a vessel of final thoughts, last wishes, and truths too delicate to speak aloud. After her passing, the boxes were collected, catalogued, and quietly reviewed by the incoming monarch. Most were routine, expected. But this one was different. It bore no official seal, only her familiar handwriting, elegantly looping in a way Charles recognized instantly. The words "for my son" only carried a weight that stopped him cold. This was personal, not as the king, as her child. But the moment he took the letter in his hands, something felt wrong. The seal, while intact, had a faint distortion too minor for most to notice, but not for those familiar with the precision of royal security. A crease in the wrong direction, a remelted edge. It was enough to raise alarms. A quiet request for a forensic inspection confirmed the suspicion the seal had been broken and expertly reattached. Someone had accessed the Queen's final words before Charles ever laid eyes on them. And what those words revealed only deepened the growing chasm inside the palace. The letter was heartbreakingly clear. It spoke not just of affection but concern. The Queen detailed her hopes for the preservation of certain jewels not for their monetary worth, but for their meaning. She wrote of the lineage woven into the gems, how each piece told a story of survival, duty, and sacrifice. She feared in her own restrained phrasing that modern eyes may see only sparkle, not substance. She referenced specific items, the emerald choker, the Greville tiara, the bangles, and requested they be kept untouched. Let them remain as they were, she wrote, for Catherine to guard and Charlotte to one day inherit. These are not adornments, they are anchors. For Charles, it was a crushing revelation. His mother had left clear intentions, and he had failed to protect them. But even more devastating was the implication. If Camilla had somehow seen this letter before him, she would have known what the Queen wanted. And still, the jewels were altered. Still, the vault was entered. Still, the legacy was rewritten. His inner circle began to piece it together. The timing, the secrecy, the silence. It no longer seemed like coincidence, it felt like premeditation. And once again, the trust between crown and consort eroded just a little further. Charles didn't speak of the letter publicly, he couldn't, but behind closed doors it changed everything. His tone, his posture, his resolve. What had once been quiet confusion began to shift into a sense of betrayal that was no longer speculative but personal. This wasn't just about Jules, it was about legacy, about loyalty, about a final message meant to protect the future, and the possibility that it had been intercepted by someone determined to reshape it. And just as the truth of Camilla's breach came into focus, an older, deeper motive began to emerge, one buried in decades of resentment and rivalry. Their rivalry was never declared, but it shaped decades of silent tension. Queen Elizabeth remained the untouchable sovereign, Camilla the controversial consort. Now, in death, their Cold War reignited through Jules, legacy, and ultimate remembrance. Behind the carefully staged royal portraits and rehearsed public displays, there had always been an invisible line drawn between Elizabeth and Camilla. The Queen, forged by war and duty, operated through legacy and silence. Camilla, shaped by scandal and exile, had learned to navigate the institution from its periphery, never quite inside, never quite out. Even after Charles pushed relentlessly for her inclusion, even after public sentiment softened, Elizabeth kept her distance. It wasn't just personal, it was structural. At royal functions, Camilla's position was noted but never elevated. Her access was regulated, her image controlled. She was allowed in but never invited. Through every ceremonial event, every state dinner, every order of the Garter where her name was carefully excluded, Camilla endured with a smile, but behind closed doors, the sting lingered. Years of protocol used as a barrier, honours withheld, titles delayed. Even on her deathbed, Queen Elizabeth had made one final unspoken gesture. Camilla was not crowned queen in title, but queen consort. A deliberate distinction. A reminder that acceptance had its limits. It was a message, carved not in stone but in silence. And Camilla read it clearly. The Queen's private jewellery collection embodied that divide. These were not just ornaments, they were symbols of favour, remembrance, and royal hierarchy. Camilla had worn few of them in life, always told they were being preserved, not appropriate for now, or simply not available. The message was consistent. These belonged to the Queen's bloodline, not her son's companion. And so, when Elizabeth passed, and Camilla gained access perhaps sooner than she was meant to, what followed was not merely opportunistic. It was calculated, emotional, a reclamation. If she had been excluded from the legacy in life, she would make herself part of it in death. Altering the jewels wasn't just about preference, it was about rewriting history, recasting the pieces in her image, removing the weight of tradition and replacing it with her own mark. The emeralds, the tiaras, the bracelets. They became a quiet rebellion disguised in sparkle. No words, no confrontation, just transformation. And in her mind, perhaps, justification. She hadn't stolen them. She had rescued them from the silence, the exclusion, the frost that had defined her entire royal journey. But to those inside the palace, and especially to Charles, the shift was chilling. Because even if it wasn't theft, it carried the scent of something just as dangerous: retaliation. A statement carved not in letters or speeches, but in diamonds and emeralds. One that said, "If you won't give me a place in your history, I'll take it myself." It was bold, it was personal, and it was irreversibly public. But personal vengeance became political poison once the palace learned the public was watching. The internet exploded. High-resolution close-ups revealed Camilla wearing jewels eerily similar to those believed lost. Side by ID comparisons went viral. And suddenly, the private scandal inside the palace was front-page news across the world. What began as a casual observation on social media spiraled into a global storm within hours. A royal fashion account posted a magnified image of a sapphire necklace Camilla had worn to a recent gala, seemingly elegant, innocuous. But within minutes, replies flooded in. A royal historian posted a side-by-side image from the 1950s, showcasing Queen Mary's sapphire piece, long believed to be housed securely in the private royal collection. The resemblance wasn't speculative, it was definitive. The unique diamond-framed sapphire centerpiece, the curved gem arrangement it matched in every critical detail. The realization spread like wildfire. This wasn't coincidence, this was confirmation. Internet sleuths pounced. Within 24 hours, a dozen YouTube channels posted full-length breakdowns, pausing, analyzing, overlaying old photographs with new footage. TikTok videos began connecting dots across timelines, jewelry appearances, and missing vault pieces, garnering millions of views. A necklace here, a brooch there, even a ring Camilla had worn during a royal tour, all now believed to be modified versions of the Queen's private heirlooms. The theories no longer felt like speculation, they were backed by forensic analysis, historical context, and irrefutable photographic evidence. The story took on a life of its own, moving from royal forums to mainstream headlines with Alibaba. Ming speed. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Monarchists voiced outrage, calling the transformations sacrilegious. Traditionalists labeled it desecration. Even neutral observers expressed disbelief. How could such historically significant pieces be altered, let alone without the king's formal declaration? Social media hashtags surged, demanding answers. What had once been a quiet internal affair had now exploded into an international scandal. Questions weren't whispered anymore. They were shouted across headlines, splashed across TV segments, dissected in panel discussions. The monarchy's silence only added fuel to the fire. Under mounting pressure, Charles found himself backed into a corner. For the first time since ascending the throne, both Parliament and the press pushed him in tandem. Members of the House demanded clarity. Royal commentators, once protective of the crown, now asked publicly, what did the king know, and when did he know it? Buckingham Palace, usually a fortress of indifference in the face of controversy, scrambled behind the scenes. Emergency meetings were held. Advisors debated strategies. Statements were drafted, scrapped, and rewritten. But the storm was moving faster than the palace could contain it. The firm, infamous for its control over narrative, realized this scandal had slipped beyond their grasp. The usual tactics, denial, deflection, silence, were no longer sufficient. Every hour that passed without a response felt like a tacit ad. Mission. And inside the royal household, tensions soared. Some advisors urged Charles to speak. Others warned that doing so would only deepen the crisis. But one thing was undeniable: the jewels had become more than jewels. They were now symbols of fracture, of secrecy, of a family war spilling into public view. And just as the monarchy teetered under scrutiny, Charles made a private decision that would send shockwaves through the bloodline. Without cameras, press, or fanfare, King Charles called a private audience with Catherine, Princess of Wales. What he handed her wasn't just a gift, it was a message to the world. The Queen's wishes would be honoured, and her legacy safeguarded. The decision had been made in silence, behind closed doors, without a press release or palace protocol to guide it. After weeks of internal pressure, scandal, and mounting public outcry, Charles stepped away from the noise and returned to what mattered most: his mother's voice, her final words, and the promises that had been broken in her name. The jewelry, those that could be retrieved, had been located, identified, and, at his instruction, painstakingly restored to their original designs. Stones had been removed from modern settings, old clasps reforged, and historical blueprints followed down to the final detail. The emerald earrings and diamond brooch, once among Elizabeth's most personal possessions, had survived the chaos. And now, they were returning to the path the Queen had intended. Catherine arrived discreetly, unaware of what awaited her. Charles, solemn and clear-eyed, said little. He held the box in his hands, not like a king performing duty, but like a son fulfilling a vow. As he opened it and revealed the contents, the room reportedly fell into complete silence. For Catherine, the moment was staggering, not because of the gems' worth, but because of what they represented. It was the Queen's legacy, unaltered, preserved. A thread of history now passed on not just to her, but eventually to Charlotte. Those watching from the inside would later say Catherine held back tears, offering only a quiet nod. There was no need for spectacle. The meaning had already spoken. Camilla, notably, was not present. The exclusion was deliberate. Palace insiders say the Queen Consort was neither consulted nor informed until the transfer had already taken place. And while no official statement was released, word travelled quickly. The symbolism was unmistakable. In gifting the restored pieces to Catherine, Charles wasn't just correcting a misstep, he was reasserting the line of succession, loyalty, and legacy. His words at the handover were brief, but chilling in their clarity. Some things are not meant to be rewritten. It wasn't a rebuke, at least not openly, but the message was unmistakable. The event was meant to remain private, a personal act of reconciliation and redirection. But the palace is a fortress of whispers, and no secret stays hidden forever. Within days, the tabloids got wind of the ceremony. Speculation erupted once again, this time not about what had been taken, but what had been returned. Images were never released, but descriptions leaked. Queen's emeralds restored, one headline read. Catherine chosen as true heir to Elizabeth's treasures, said another. The monarchy didn't deny the story, nor did they confirm it, but the silence this time rang differently, less like avoidance, more like quiet confirmation. The public, already stirred into frenzy by the scandal, now saw something else, resolution, however partial. A wrong was being righted, a legacy defended, and for the first time since the revelations began, the tide of outrage began to shift into something more complex: curiosity, reflection, and a renewed scrutiny on Camilla's role in it all. But while one legacy was restored, another remained in peril. Camilla's reputation was fractured, and her silence would no longer hold. For the first time in her royal life, Queen Camilla defied tradition and gave an unsanctioned personal interview. Her voice, calm but edged with resentment, pierced through the silence. And her version of events would ignite even more questions. It wasn't pre-approved, it wasn't filtered through Buckingham's communication machine. And it wasn't expected. But perhaps that was the point. With her reputation smouldering under public scrutiny, Camilla chose to break centuries of royal protocol by sitting down for an exclusive, raw conversation with one of the monarchy's most trusted yet bold correspondents. No formal set, no scripted statements, just Camilla, guarded yet resolute, determined to reclaim control of a narrative that had spiraled beyond even her calculated reach. From the moment the interview aired, it was clear this was no apology, it was a rebuttal. She began with the jewels, directly, openly, no evasions. The redesigns, she claimed, were not acts of vanity or betrayal, but of preservation. Tradition, she said softly, can be honored in form or in feeling. I chose the latter. Her voice never trembled, but the tension behind her words was unmistakable. The reimagined jewels were, in her view, symbols of continuity, not desecration. Her framing was clinical, strategic. Jewels must be worn to stay alive in memory, she declared. Otherwise they become museum relics, cold, forgotten. She insisted that she had no knowledge of the Queen's letter, had never seen it, had never been informed of its contents. And if Charles believed otherwise, he hadn't said it to her face. But it was what she said next that silenced the room. When asked if she felt misunderstood by both the palace and the public, she paused and then responded with a cryptic warning. People forget what she took from me, she said. The interviewer, stunned, pressed her to explain, but she offered no further detail, just a distant look and a long silence. Was she speaking of years lost in exile from royal life? Of humiliations suffered during the Diana era? Of a crown she was once promised would never be hers? No one could say for sure, but in that moment, her words hung like a dagger in the air. The backlash was immediate. Palace advisors, blindsided by the interview, scrambled to contain the fallout. No one had been consulted, no one had approved it. Internally, reports emerged of Charles erupting in fury not just at the breach of protocol but at the tone. The implication that his mother had taken something from Camilla was seen by many as a line too far. This wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration of grievance. Camilla had stepped out from behind the veil of ceremonial silence and, in doing so, shattered the royal code of discretion. Her message was unmistakable. She would not be vilified in silence. But while the interview may have offered her a platform, it also invited deeper questions. Was this an act of desperation or defiance? A final stand or the start of a new fracture? Public reaction was divided. Some admired her candor, others condemned her audacity. The monarchy, already weakened by scandal, now found itself navigating yet another wave of division, this time from within. And yet, in the ruins of scandal and sorrow, Charles was left with one final deck. A symbolic move that could silence everything, or tear the crown in two. The king stood alone. Pressured by tradition, loyalty, and betrayal, Charles issued a royal command with no precedent. What he did next would either mend the monarchy or cement the deepest rift between crown and consort in royal history. He had weighed the silence long enough, the whispers in the halls, the divided public, the strain behind the palace doors. Something had to be done, not to appease, not to distract, but to draw a definitive line between preservation and erasure. In a move that shocked even his closest advisors, Charles signed a private order to permanently remove several key items from circulation, not because they were lost, but because they had been found and forever changed. These were the pieces too tainted by controversy, too symbolic of division to wear again. They would no longer serve fashion or ceremony, they would serve memory. And only memory. A new vault was commissioned, separate from both the crown jewels and the Queen's private collection. It would not belong to the reigning monarch, it would belong to the future. Access restricted to heirs, its contents locked under strict directive, preserving what remained of Elizabeth's untouched legacy. At the heart of it would sit the restored originals, those recovered and brought back from redesign. They would not be altered again. Not under Charles, not under anyone. But the boldest move came with the King's next command, the formal creation of the Queen Elizabeth Legacy Collection, a royal archive dedicated to preserving the late Queen's personal intentions, her jewellery, her letters, her vision of continuity through blood and time. Its purpose was clear: to protect the inheritance of Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Princess Charlotte of Cambridge. It would follow the lines Elizabeth herself had once outlined. And in that declaration, another name was conspicuously missing. Camilla. She was not included in the inheritance line. Not now, not later, not at all. No formal statement announced her exclusion. No explicit explanation was offered. But to royal watchers, the message was deafening. In the world of monarchy, silence speaks volumes. And this silence, this calculated omission, resonated louder than any speech could have. The public was given only a vague announcement. A note from the palace spoke of steps taken to preserve Her late Majesty's personal wishes and safeguard royal continuity for future generations. But behind those words, an unmistakable line had been drawn. Between tradition and transformation. Between those chosen by legacy and those whose roles would never quite rise beyond ceremonial. Inside the palace, however, the storm had not yet settled. Camilla, though silent publicly, was said to be livid. Her position remained unchanged by title but weakened in spirit. The standoff between her and Charles had entered a new phase, one of cool distance, quiet rebuke, and unspoken fra. Sure, the crown had survived, yes, but not unscathed. The cost of clarity was paid in personal loss. But as the crown survives another storm, one truth remains. In the royal family, nothing stays buried forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.